Hi everyone, I'm Cristina. I'm from Spain, from Barcelona, but I'm doing a master's degree on gender and development at Université Paris in Paris, France. I would like to thank all the organizers of this Women in War conference for giving me the great opportunity to participate at this event. And I would like also to devote my lecture to all persons that have disappeared or murdered relative in Mexico, to all of those who are and who have been asking for justice and for the well-being of their missing, and to all the people who are walking besides them to try to put an end to this terrible period Mexicans are living. Today we get together to think about the experiences and consequences of war in women, starting from this vanishing point that was the traumatic and terrible event of the First World War in Europe. But think about women in war brings about the need to recognize the struggle of women against war, the collective effort of women to stop war. 1 month ago, the Women International League for Peace and Freedom, born of women's opposition to the First World War, celebrated its 99th birthday. We know that we have much to celebrate about the important role women have played in contesting wars throughout the 20th and 21st century. And in the last decades, feminist research have demonstrated that women's concern with peace does not come from this binary model that presents women as peaceful and men as warfaring. It comes from the specific social experience on the gender order, which intersects with other power systems as racial, ethno-national, and economic class power. As a result, women's vision of war is distinctive because it tends to recognize the link between these different kind of populations. However, we have the impression that our efforts have not been stronger enough because wars and armed conflicts are still alive today in many countries, taking many new forms and new diverse actors, and blurring the boundaries between civil population and combatants. The war on drugs in Mexico, which is the context of the paper I'm presenting today, is similar to other conflicts in Europe or in the Middle East that we are addressing at this conference, as that of Afghanistan or Syria or Bosnia. In both is uselessness and the scale of waste of human lives and resources. Unless Mexican government does not admit the existence of an armed conflict on its territory, on its country, the fact is in 2012 the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights placed Mexico as the second country with the highest number of deaths, just after Syria. The government of the USA plays an important part on war drugs in Mexico, so violence in the country could not be understood without referring to its security or counter-insurgency and business agenda, which includes the North American Free Trade Agreement that came into force in January 1994, and the terrible consequences of the neoliberal strategies and the structural adjustment programs. Today, there are hundreds of thousands murdered, missing, and displaced in Mexico. There are also tens of abandoned villages and an emerging culture of violence. And Mexico has turned into a collective psychological trauma, which has been defined by social psychologist Ignacio Martín Baró as the traumatic crystallization on individuals and groups of dehumanized social relations. A couple years ago, when I was reviewing my Facebook, some intriguing pictures appeared on my in my news feed. The pictures that we were being shared by some of my friends showed some handkerchiefs like the ones my father used to blow his nose until the famous tissue paper came into use. However, these special handkerchiefs were embroidered by with thread or grand thread. Some of them had drawings too, and I was thrilled by the beauty of this clothing wall, and then I was appalled by the stories that were captured in them. Like, a man was found dead in the trunk of a car near Chilpancingo, Guerrero. Elisa, you went missing on August 23, 2011. Your family is still waiting for you. I have never embroidered before. I only knew the so-called cross-stitch that my aunt taught me when I was younger. And it was the same stitch that my mother hated because the nuns punished her whenever she did not finish her homework. The pictures I saw in my Facebook newsfeed were published by the group Bordamos por la Paz Guadalajara, which means Embroidering for Peace Guadalajara. On August 2012, just after the foundation of the Movement for Peace with Justice and Dignity on Mexico, some artists belonging to a collective named Red Fountains, named like that because they painted in red the two main fountains of Mexico City as a form of symbolic protest against violence, started launched the action Embroider for Peace, one handkerchief, one victim. The action consisted in embroidering the almost 50,000 martyrs with red thread in order to show them on Mexico City main square, the Zócalo, as an ephemeral memorial for the victims of war on drugs waged by then President Felipe Calderón. Alfredo Casanova, who is a sculptor and member of this collective named Red Fountains, transferred the initiative to Guadalajara, which is the second city of Mexico, in order to be performed at Solidarity Week at ITESO, which is a Jesuit university. He organized the first embroidering sitting, and then the initiative was arrogated by a group of local women. Since then, the group started to meet each Sunday on Revolution Park, Parque de la Revolución. The members between 10 and 15 of Bordamos por la Paz define themselves as a group of persons with different ideologies, beliefs, professions, age, and so on, united to embroider handkerchiefs with the end of naming and remembering the murdered and missing in this bloody war. Despite its mixed composition, the group is mostly composed, organized, and led by women. The handkerchiefs reflect several types of violence. The ones in red thread are for the murdered and symbolize the tragic loss and the bloodshedding. The ones in green are for the missing and symbolize the hope for finding them. In purple or pink thread are embroidered the femicides. In black thread, the complaints and the hate crimes. Meanwhile, in blue, some have embroidered advices for immigrants that cross Mexico, and some others have chosen poems or quotes to put on handkerchiefs. The different issues reflected by the handkerchiefs reflect that or indicate that Bordamos por la Paz Guadalajara is not only concerned by the question of peace. It addresses also women's rights, injustice, and other sexual and social rights. Most of the times, the stories captured in these handkerchiefs are taken from a civilian body count and naming called Les Days Here, in Spanish, Menos Días Aquí, envisioned and managed since 2010 by the association Our Apparent Rendition, which means Nuestra Aparente Rendición. Group activities go around embroidering meetings that take place, as we have said, each Sunday. However, the group has also participated in demonstrations and other activities against violence. It also has organized two main events on 2012 and 2013 called memorials in tribute to the victims and their families. These important ceremonial events aim not only to emphasize on the importance of recognition of memory, but create a sense of collective emotionality that could be very important as a way of initiating a process of overcoming this traumatic event. It should be noted that the Embroidering Group of Guadalajara is just one of the groups that have arisen as a result of the action launched by the collective Fuentes Rojas Red Fountains. Today, there are more than 30 embroidering for peace groups around Mexico and other countries. There are groups in Barcelona, Spain, in Cordoba, Argentina, in Durham, UK, in Brazil, and so on, even in New York. However, these groups are autonomous and have different structures and objectives. We've chosen that of Guadalajara because it's the first group who has been created, because it has been the more visible and more structured, and because it is shaped mainly by women. There was no embroidering in pre-Hispanic Mexico. It was a practice brought by the Spaniards during the colony that was later adapted by the regional communities to express elements of their cosmogony, of their identity or traditions. Even if it was not an activity only for women, we know, because we know some Masawa men that need gloves and hats, the embroidering has been associated to the feminine sphere by an androcentric and a hegemonic Mexican culture. It is inevitably linked with a specific feminine experience, not necessarily biological or natural, that relates women with the role of knitting community ties and building memory. Several of the elements associated with embroidering are present in this initiative, but in this case, women and men use the same techniques as a mean to raise awareness on what is happening in Mexico. It transforms an act of memory that seeks to restore life with the value and dignity it deserves and that has been obviated. It is also a demand for reconciliation, for the recovery of everyday life as it was before the war, and for patching the social tissue. In Latin America, we can find several examples of how the recovery of symbolic practices like the embroidery has had a clear political objectives. The first example is la Ruta Pacífica de Mujeres por la negociación política de los conflictos, namely Women's Peaceful Road for the Political Negotiation of Conflicts, which is the one of the biggest and well-known women movements for peace in Colombia. It was created during the 90s and works as a network of more than 300 organizations and women associations of the 8 regions of Colombia. Indigenous, black, young, peasant, city, displaced, and all women form part of this network. It is a pacifist, non-militaristic and feminist movement and asks for memory, truth, and justice processes through reconciliation and the recognition of the other. One of its main objectives, as it's been said by sociologist and feminist writer Cynthia Cockburn, the deconstruction of a pervasive symbolism of violence and war, and its substitution for a new visual and textual language that have often references with women's practices and knowledge. They think the use of rituals and symbolism does not mean the abandonment of reason, but the use of emotion and intuition as a new visual languages that can deconstruct the language of violence. We can find most of these elements in Embroidering for Peace. The symbolism linked to the threads is also present in the La Ruta. In their web page, they explain that they use the yellow for truth, white for justice, green for hope, and blue for compensation. In their public demonstrations, they embroider tapestries with flags and pictures, as you are seeing on this slide. They use the embroidery as a metaphor to relate connections and cycles and to deconstruct the meaning of violence through the construction of a peace and non-violent culture. So there are other countries where we find other movements like Embroidering for Peace. In Chile, for example, we find the second example I'm going to talk about. Let's go back to Augusto Pinochet regime and remember the movement of the arpilleristas who created the arpilleras. These poor worker and peasant women elaborated beautiful tapestries as a form of resistance, of expressions of resistance against totalitarian repression. The movement was born in 1973 with the support of the Catholic Church. The arpilleristas did not embroider stories because they live in a period where certain words were unpronounceable, but they recreated and showed everyday life kind of scenes in their tapestries. Some of these scenes represented mothers that were searching for their missing ones, or arbitrary detentions, even misery and extreme poverty settings. According to Marjorie Argossin, the Chilean women talked from a style considered feminine, from a technique that was born out of necessity and imagination, from which they made several themes concur with their own modes of expression. These women turned themselves in political subjects and promoters of social change through testimonial and popular objects that were also forms of social protest. However, as in the case of the Mexican handkerchiefs, the Chilean tapestries were not only objects of memory, they are objects that reconnect through threads and stitches a truncated life with the one of the person that embroidered it. Besides being used as a strategy of memory and protest, embroidering implies occupying the political and public space and sometimes putting the body at risk in a country where this public space is less and less safe, less and less accessible, and more violent. Besides Marjorie Argossan, the professor of University of Michigan, Elena Moyarraggio, who has been particularly interested in the recuperation of the forbidden memory of Chile, think that tapestries of the arpilleristas are works of art that narrate historical events but also help to keep memory, to advance justice and truth processes, and to bring forward humanization in a context of terror. This dispute if the works of the arpilleras should be considered art or even popular art is an interesting one. Their works were noted in Chile as a collective expression, an anonymous expression of popular art that was influenced by the extreme needs of the women. The case of Bordamos por la Paz Guadalajara is different because expression was born out of individual responsibility and political solidarity and not for survival. Since the beginning, the embroidering initiative in Mexico has rejected the handkerchiefs as a work of art because they think it tarnishes its use as protest tools, and they also think it's a way to keep them away from turning into consumer goods. If we look from other perspective, the handkerchiefs are alienated from institutions like museums in charge of rating or grading the view and the objects. On the contrary, I think this initiative should be seen as a type of collective art that uses certain techniques to denounce violence and to elaborate a demand to restore peace and life in Mexico. It is also a way to create empathy with the victims and a way to reignite and re-embroider the social tissue so harmed by extreme violence. That's why I don't like to include the terms of art popular while explaining this initiative, because I prefer to look at the embroidered handkerchiefs as aesthetical and political narrations of the human catastrophe in Mexico. In this was, I think, I can appeal with responsibility, conscience, and sensibilization of Mexican society. As political and testimonial narratives, handkerchiefs build a memory not about the past but about the present of the conflict, appealing to and demanding the public rehabilitation of the victims. Handkerchiefs make no distinction between innocent victims and guilty victims. They use a language of reconciliation that go against the non-pacification of language, namely the criminalization of victims as narcos. Doing that, they can be seen as a form of counter-memory or a memory of non-stigmatization that affirms itself against the official history of silence and impunity that has been held by government of the former president Felipe Calderon and of the current president Enrique Peña Nieto. Through the appropriation of a traditional practice associated to the patriarchal structure in which women are confined to the domestic sphere, and through its inversion to be used as a strategy for political struggle, women transform embroidery into a collective and political practice of care, caring society becoming a form of resistance against the stigmatization and the dehumanization. They don't define themselves as feminists by the work made by Bordamos por la Paz Guadalajara, can be considered a form of degender women's collective action for peace, capable of of redefining gender hierarchy from within a kinship discourse. Thank you very much.